All right. So hello, everyone. We have the one and only Joe Schmid. There are no other people named Joe Schmid on the planet. He's a PhD student at Princeton, right? Yeah, and he's written exactly Aleph Null papers that have been published in prestigious and high-ranking journals. He also has a YouTube channel that's linked in the thing below the description. I think, yeah, and um, there was one more thing I was going to say, but I don't really remember what it was. But just know there's at least one other impressive thing about him. Take it on higher order evidence that there is. Yeah. So we're going to be talking about the anthropic argument for theism, which is an argument that my friend Amos Woolen and I were writing a paper in which we present this argument. Even though I'm not a theist, though Amos is, but I think it's a pretty good argument. And so yeah, I think maybe it would be helpful for me to just start out explaining the argument and then we can discuss it. So the basic argument is okay, so we start with a surprising fact, which is, I exist. And that's kind of surprising. And there are a lot of people who could have existed instead of me. And so suppose that the world only had 10 billion people, that there were only 10 billion ever created. Well, what are the odds that I'd be one of the lucky 10 billion? Well, the odds are zero. And the reason that the odds are zero is that David Lewis showed that a lower bound on the number of possible people is Beth2, which is pretty large infinity. One way to make infinites bigger is you take the power set of the previous infinite, and then you get a bigger infinite. And so if you take Aleph Null, which is the smallest infinite, and then you take the power set of it, and the power set of it again, that's Beth2. Okay, so Lewis showed there are at least Beth2 possible agents. So if there are only 10 billion agents, the odds out of the Beth2 possible agents, the odds that I'd be one of the lucky 10 billion are zero. It's a finite number or an uncountably infinite number, or not number, but set or whatever. And so, uh, and so on account of that, it's very surprising that we exist. But here's one thing that might make it less surprising that we exist, which is suppose that theism were true. Well, I think it's very plausible that it's good to create a person who lives a good life. And so plausibly, God would create all possible people, given that he could provide each of them a good life. And so for that reason, theism predicts with relatively high probability that that all people would be created, and so it predicts with relatively high probability that I would exist. So theism predicts, makes it very likely that I would exist. Atheism makes it very unlikely, and I do exist, so that's evidence for theism over atheism. And you might think, well, what about just having like an infinitely big universe or something? But the problem is there aren't enough people. So an infinitely big universe would only have Aleph Null people, while there are Beth2 possible people. And so even if you have an infinite universe or an infinite multiverse, you actually have to employ some fairly creative accounting to actually be able to get Beth2 people. And so on account of that, theism has a very good, nice account of why there would be Beth2 people, while in atheism, it's very difficult to get a coherent account. So yeah, that's the basic argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely interesting, and I'd love to see this paper once it's out or once you've written it and so on, because it sounds super interesting. And I'm actually not opposed, in principle, to this being a successful argument. Successfully showing that there's an evidential chip, at least in theism's favor. So I'm not opposed to that in principle, but I can at least provide ways that someone might try to push back here. So that's probably what I'll try to do. But just for the audience, don't take my pushing back in certain regards as necessarily endorsing those ways in which I push back, because I'm really just trying to explore this here. I don't really have a settled view on the argument yet, but I'm certainly open to this being a new and interesting piece of evidence for theism. Okay, so with that out of the way, I guess there are a few ways that we might go here. One of them is to, I mean, you were mentioning, well, hold on a second. Like, what if we don't just have an atheistic hypothesis, which is just the bare denial of theism? Instead, what if we conjoin the denial of theism together with some auxiliary hypothesis, which at least better predicts the data? Now, what would that auxiliary hypothesis be? Well, you gave the example of maybe like an infinite universe, or maybe an infinite multiverse, and then you pointed out that, well, I mean, like, absent some kind of cool finessing, that's not going to give us Beth2 agents, certainly. But here's something that might give us Beth2 agents. Modal realism, right? David Lewis, you mentioned him. He famously had this view where every possible world, every comprehensive or total or complete or maximal way that reality could be corresponds to a concretely existent spatiotemporally interconnected maximal world, basically. And so then there really are concrete worlds out there where pigs are flying, and other concrete worlds where there are these different agents and so on. So like that theory seems to definitely predict that I would exist, because it predicts that every possible agent exists. So I wonder what you think about that kind of pushback.
Yeah. So I mean, a few points. The first one is that I think that it's true that, like, even suppose that modal realism perfectly explained all of this, this would still be a very strong argument for theism, because conditional on atheism, the probability of modal realism is like, it's very low. And so I think for that reason, even if you can come up with some auxiliary hypothesis to explain it, if that auxiliary hypothesis is not something supported by the rest of our evidence, then that makes it sort of ad hoc, and it's going to decrease the probability of atheism.
Right. I mean, just to butt in here, I know you have multiple more other things to say, but I did just want to. I do think this move would probably be best for someone who is already kind of antecedently at least sympathetic with modal realism, because then they're going to think that actually the probability of modal realism conditional on atheism is not like terribly low. I think they're probably going to think that. I mean, even if they think it's like relatively low, I mean, that'll suffice to cut out much of the evidential bite, at least in the argument.
Yeah. So I think, right. So if you're antecedently sympathetic to modal realism, then I think this is maybe a fine option. Though, I mean, the number of people who are sympathetic to modal realism, it's like 5 in the world. And so
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I mean, I might be exaggerating slightly, but like, it seems like virtually everyone finds modal realism super implausible. And so if you find modal realism super implausible, that then it seems kind of weird for there to be and then, I mean, just in terms of sorry, you look like you were gonna
I did want to say something on that point. I mean, to the extent that one finds modal realism implausible, do you think that they're also going to find like a theistic multiverse, or maybe even like what is required under theism here per this argument? I mean, it seems like theism itself is predicting that there are indeed going to be like something like Beth 2 agents or something. They're not all going to fit in our universe plausibly. So like theism itself seems to require this ginormous, infinite like multiverse. And to the extent that modal realism is implausible, they might surely will find that implausible for the same reason, no?
I don't know. I mean, the thing is, like, I mean, and I find modal realism implausible for one very specific reason, which is that I think it undermines induction, that I don't think applies to theism. But I actually, like, lots of people seem to have this incredulous stare reaction to modal realism that I really just don't have at all. So I think, so maybe if people are inclined to give an incredulous stare to modal realism, they'd similarly be for a theistic vast multiverse. But I don't think that's so obvious. I heard Plantinga at one point suggest that he thought that God would plausibly create all the agents for whom it would be good to create. Draper suggested a similar thing. People seem to be more open to the idea that, like, God would just, want to create a lot of different people. And to the extent that he'd want to create a lot of different people, like, why would he just arbitrarily stop at, a quadrillion or whatever? It seems like he would just create all the people. I think it's like, if you can show that falls out of theism, which I think it does on pretty minimal assumptions, then I think people who are committed to theism, which is a lot of people, will find this to be a lot more plausible than modal realism.
Yeah, I mean, I'd want to see what reason specifically they find modal realism implausible. I think again, this is probably just going to go down to like just their background beliefs and so on, because it might very well be an incredulous stare. Like, I think at least when I've talked about modal realism with non-philosophers, usually it's just like, well, that's just ludicrous. Like, just stop talking. Like, just go away. But like, to the extent that they have that sort of reaction, it's just a kind of intuitive kind of gut reaction rejection of it. It seems like that would apply equally to theism's. I mean, even if it's antecedently motivated under theism, the point is just like that consequence which follows under minimal assumptions given theism, the consequence which follows is so implausible. So you just do the modus tollens basically for these people. So I guess it'll really just depend on how, on like what reason they have for rejecting modal realism.
Yeah, I think it would depend on that, but I don't know, like, I mean, if it is an incredulous stare, then I don't like. I don't really. Well, I don't really find either of them to be like intuitively implausible. I think that there are additional arguments for or against both of them that
You don't think
affect.
actual infinites are just obviously absurd?
Yeah. Well, actually,
You know,
I was convinced that actual infinites are not obviously absurd, basically by this argument, right? It's like if actual infinites were absurd, I almost certainly wouldn't exist. And so,
that's
if you
interesting.
adopt the
That's a cool
self-limitation,
argument.
yeah, if you
Yeah, I mean,
adopt
I actually have the opposite the opposite intuition to like Craig et al. Like, I just think they're so obviously benign and like so obviously possible. But anyway,
yeah, but I mean, and we can sort of talk about the reasons why I think modal realism is a bit implausible. One that I think is going to be a person who adopts this line of reasoning will be especially vulnerable to is that I think this makes modal realism really poorly predict the data, where conditional just on the fact that you exist. On modal realism, you could be in any of a huge range of different states. Many of them counterinductive. Many of them would involve you being a Boltzmann brain. Many of them would involve you just being in a completely different situation. Well, plausibly, if you buy the arguments for theism, theism predicts that you'd be sort of in a stable, orderly universe without where things are psychophysically harmonious and where there isn't, complete chaos. And so, and like, I don't know, on modal realism, it seems like you should be indifferent between the possible, like all of the possible worlds that you could be in. And I don't know how many that is, or what, like if there's a coherent way to talk about what percentage of them you have your current experiences. But like, I don't know, it seems like a lot. Like at least Alf, no, probably. Um, I feel like you could show that by just like, it's conceivable. Well, maybe not. I don't know. Exactly how many is going to be complicated, but the point is just there are a lot of different experiences that you could have, and so modal realism doesn't restrict the possible experiences, while theism plausibly does, which makes it a better theory.
yeah. So about theism restricting, I mean, like, suppose, like, I guess it may depend on our views about what makes lives go well. Suppose you have a kind of like hedonic approach, as I think you may very well have. Seems like lots of like there can be. How do I say this? There are. It seems like there are momentary agents who are in counterinductive worlds or radical skeptical worlds, who nevertheless have a life that is worth living by the hedonist's lights, because, like, let's say the balance of pleasure over pain over them is like, positive or whatever. Maybe they exist for a second, and it's just like a little second of pleasure or something or whatever. But like, it seems like maybe if you combine theism with this kind of hedonic approach, then actually you're still going to be saddled with this inductive problem, because the vast majority of agents are just going to be very, very short-lived ones, who are just very shortly experiencing some net balance, net positive balance of utility or something like that. And most of those are going to be Boltzmann brains or brains in vats or live in counterinductive worlds.
Yeah, so I don't think that theism necessarily implies that, because I think so. What like one thing God could do is he could just make like just all the worlds that are good on the whole. But the worry there, well, I think we know that if there is God, he didn't do that because that would undermine induction for the same reason modal realism is. It would, but then I think we have a principal explanation of why he wouldn't do that, which is like here's a better theory, which is that he would create each individual in the world that makes them flourish most in the long term, that makes them best off overall. And this would be better for literally each of the best two possible agents. And there are some other reasons in infinite ethics where like you can show that there are cases where like every part of a world is good, but then where like you make every part of a world better, but then you make every person worse off. And it seems like in cases like that, that you shouldn't do it. And so I think in a similar case, you wouldn't like what one cares about is not the worlds having good stuff. What one cares about is things going well for individual people, for these receptacles of value, or not, sorry, non-receptacles of value, other way around. And so on account of that, I think you would expect on theism just to make the world that is best for each individual person. And then, like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like there are cases where the world, like, so given the epistemic position I'm in, I should not think, it's very unlikely that the world that's best for me would be radically counterinductive.
Well, hold on a second. I mean, like, suppose we take like origin essentialism, and if that's the case, well then like Boltzmann brains would just kind of pop into existence in the void or something like that. I mean, like the best world for that, like the only worlds in which they exist, like this Boltzmann brain exists, are worlds in which they are Boltzmann brains. Basically, Boltzmann brains are essentially Boltzmann brains because that's a fact about like their origins, and origins we could suppose are essential, as is kind of a plausible thesis that metaphysicians generally take. If that's the case, well then like for at least for any Boltzmann brain out there in modal space, the best world for that individual, there's still going to be a Boltzmann brain, right? And it still seems like then that the vast majority of the people who are having like net positive utility experiences or whatever are indeed going to be ones that are Boltzmann brains. So like it seems again that theism itself is still going to be leading to these skeptical worries.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very good reason to think that it's not the case that theism, like something roughly like hedonistic utilitarianism, and origin essentialism are all true. But I don't think origin essentialism is true. I think you're a soul. But
okay.
Even if you, but even if you don't think you're like, yeah. So if you don't think that you're a soul, what I think you should think is probably that you should think, scandalously and heretically, that hedonistic utilitarianism is not correct, and instead that it would be wrong of God to create a world where you exist for 5 minutes, have a good time, and then disappear. There also get to be tricky issues where, well, the cardinality of the set of the people who are in inductive worlds and counterinductive worlds it's going to be the same, and so it's not clear. It's not clear that there are more of them, or it just sort of breaks probability. Yeah, but I mean,
I don't have a settled view on that. That's a very difficult problem. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess but I think you can, if you have these three pretty controversial like metaphysical theses, or these two in addition to theism plus the self-indication assumption, okay, then you get a problem, then you undermine induction. But I just think you don't accept all things. These ingredients explode when mixed together.
Right, but like then I guess like the point is like then to the extent that you're antecedently justified or sympathetic at least to the non-theistic ones, to the same extent you're going to be disinclined towards the theistic one. The relevant conjuncts within the unsatisfiable set. But okay, anyway, so that's the modal. I think it's an interesting discussion. We could go on and on about modal realism, but we might want to explore other aspects of the argument. One aspect that we might want to look at is, this self-indication assumption that you were mentioning. So why don't you spell that out for the audience, and then say its role in the argument, and then maybe I can push back.
Okay, so the self-indication assumption, there are different precise formulations of it. Sort of the two main ones are, the first one says you should reason as if you're like randomly selected from the possible beings that could exist. And the other version is you should reason as if there are more beings that are like you. You should think that all else equal, a hypothesis that says that there are twice as many beings that are relevantly like you, that's twice as likely to be the case. I think that this is really plausible, and I think there are kind of knockdown arguments for it, which I'll get to in a moment. But I mean, the basic intuitive gloss is it's like, okay, I'm a particular agent that, and if there are more people that are relevantly like me, then the odds that I be one of them are higher, right? It doesn't matter how many spiders there are. That doesn't increase the probability that I would exist. But if there are more humans around, then the odds that I would be one of the humans that's around are higher. Now, the argument does rely on the self-indication assumption because, so there are other views like the self-sampling assumption, which say you should reason as if you're randomly selected from the group of actual observers, where you like you determine the observers that are like you, and then you reason as if you're just a random one drawn from the actually existing observers that are relevantly like you. And if you think that, then you shouldn't think that the universe is like super big, because just making there be more observers in your reference class makes it so that you're more anomalous. So the argument, it will rely on the self-indication assumption, but I think the self-indication assumption is very obvious, and the basic argument for it, I think it just falls out of applying, just being a Bayesian about the fact that you exist. It's like, I exist and I have these current internal states. This is, I don't know which of the possible beings that are like me I am, but you just do probability math about the fact that you exist. But I think the bigger reason to think that it's true is that otherwise you get really absurd consequences. So there's an argument called the doomsday argument, which says you should think humanity is going to die very soon. And the reason for that is that if humanity doesn't die soon, then you're anomalously early. So, there have been about 110 billion humans who have ever lived, I think. And so suppose that there go on to be an extra quadrillion people. Well, then the odds that you'd be one of the first 110 billion are super low. And so if you adopt the self-indication assumption, there's a very easy way out of this argument, which is you just say, look, it's true that if there are more people, the odds I'd be early are low. But if there are more people, the odds I would exist would be higher. And so that just the two probabilities exactly cancel out, and you get not being almost certain that we'll die soon. But if you don't have it, then I think the doomsday argument is just a completely straightforward application of probabilistic reasoning, where it's like, yeah, there's this, if the world is very large, has lots of people, it's weird that I'm so early. And the more people the world has, the stranger it is. Now, maybe you think that the doomsday argument, you just bite the bullet and you say, yeah, okay, maybe we're all doomed. But I think that if you do that, you get even crazier results, which are in the vicinity. So there's a famous case given by Nick Bostrom. Now, Bostrom kind of bites the bullet on this, which I think is a little crazy. But so Adam and Eve, they're in the Garden of Eden, and they're the first two people, and they're thinking of having sex. And they're like, well, but, we don't want to get pregnant. And then they're like, well, but if we got pregnant, then we would spawn this great, huge civilization. And then we would be anomalously early. So thus, we can be super confident that Eve will not get pregnant. That does not seem like a safe form of birth control. And you can get even crazier cases where it's like, okay, imagine if Adam and Eve have this surefire way to make sure that Eve will get pregnant, where there's 100% chance it'll work, and they agree to do that unless just a deer drops dead before them. Then they should expect the deer to drop dead before them, because otherwise they would be anomalously early. And my claim is that unless you think that the odds of your existence go up if there are more people, you just get all these results kind of trivially.
Yeah. I mean, really interesting literature here. I'm aware that the literature exists, and related to self-locating belief and probability, and like the presumptive philosopher problem and all these sorts of things. I'm aware that literature exists, but I'm not very steeped in it. So I will try to say something competent at this point. But I wonder what you think about this point. Maybe this is just hopelessly confused. I don't know. But do you think that this principle itself, just by itself, kind of leads to skepticism? I mean, don't you think that, among the possible agents like you, it's kind of hard to spell that out. What is the like you? Is it sharing your evidence? Is that what it is? Or is it like phenomenologically indistinguishable? Is that what it is? Or, but anyway, suppose that the relevant possible agents that are like, yeah, go on.
Well, I can just describe how I think you should think of it. It's the agents that are relevantly like you are the ones where, based on your current evidence, you can't rule out yourself being. Right? Okay, so imagine I'm in a dark room, and I know there's one person in each of the 50 states in the United States, and they're all in a dark room. Well, they would all be relevantly like me, because I have no evidence that rules out me being any particular one of them. But I do have evidence that rules out me being, like a cockroach or something. So you shouldn't think there are extra cockroaches on this assumption, except as a consequence, I think there are a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. So let's call these your evidential twins. Okay. So the agents that are relevantly like you, they're your evidential twins. Now, if we're supposed to reason as if we're kind of randomly selected from our evidential twins, I mean, we might think that there are vastly many more evidential twins of me that are in skeptical scenarios than that aren't. You might think that. And if so, then that's going to be difficult because it seems like we'd have to reason as if we're like randomly selected from among this class, and then it seems like we're going to be cast into the pit of skepticism. So is that like a genuine worry? Like, what do you think about that?
So I would imagine that the number of like confused twins, well, I mean, it might be zero. It might be that God, that just there is not like there's some reason why there's no being whose life is made maximally well off by being in a skeptical scenario. But if there are some, I'd imagine it would be the same cardinality as the number of people who are uh, as the number of people who are not in skeptical scenarios. But
okay, so hold on. Suppose that we're atheists. Like, because I mean, outside of this argument, like you are indeed an atheist, and if you grant the self-indication assumption, I mean, if we're atheists, then like it seems like if fundamental reality is kind of indifferent to the flourishing and languishing of the relevant like evidential twins, then it seems like it may very well be the case that like modal space is like vastly outnumbered by evidential twins of yours that are in skeptical scenarios. So maybe even theism helps, but let's just set that aside. Like as an atheist, how are you able to accept a self-indication assumption?
Yeah, so I think that so I think it's not clear. I think the number of evidential twins would be the same who are in a skeptical scenario would probably be the same cardinality the number of people who are like you. And so I think if you're a frequentist, this is going to be a real problem because it's like, how do I say, I can't say 75% of the people who are like me are not in skeptical scenarios. But I think you could say that based on your current evidence, you have good reason to think you're not in a skeptical scenario, right? So suppose that everyone in Hilbert's hotel rolls a die. The number of people who get 1 through 6 or 1 through 5 if the 6-sided die is going to be equal to the number of people who roll 6. But you should, I think be split your credences across the possible die rolls that you would get, because based on your particular evidence, you would end up rejecting. They're all equally probable, and then I think. Like, I sort of think not being in a skeptical scenario, it's sort of like a data point where it's just like any theory that implies that you are in a skeptical scenario is false. And so if you're an atheist, I think you should hold out for some theory X that explains both why you shouldn't think you're in a skeptical scenario, and also why, and also means that there are at least best 2 people.
Yeah, I wonder how there could be such a theory if we accept the self-indication assumption.
Yeah.
But
and then, one other just brief point. I think if you're a theist, then like this is sort of good news. It's like, oh no, if you're an atheist and you don't adopt the self-indication assumption, you have just total skepticism. Okay, like that's a pretty good,
Yeah. Well, I know. I mean, I just thought it was interesting because you seem to be an atheist who accepts it, so that's why I was pushing that note. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm currently not sure what to say about this as an atheist. I'm
okay.
Holding out for theory X that explains.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I like it. Okay, so we explored that a little bit. I guess the next point that we can explore is, I mean, like this sort of reasoning.
Just one more brief point about the self-indication assumption. So you might think like, I think what is maybe rational is to like be kind of undecided about anthropics, because there are lots of really smart people who disagree, and anthropics is like just notoriously like one of the most tricky areas of philosophy. Now I think the self-indication assumption just is way more plausible than the other view, but like, okay, it seems maybe you should be like sort of undecided. But if you're sort of undecided, then I think maybe that gives you a reason to affirm the combination of theism and the self-indication assumption for the following reason. So suppose atheism's true and the self-sampling assumption, suppose they're both true. Well, or sorry, let's start with atheism and the self-indication assumption. For the reasons I gave earlier, I don't think it's super likely that you would exist, because there would maybe be Aleph null people, but that's hardly any. Um, it's not enough. You don't have Beth 2 people, and so on account of that, it's very unlikely that you would exist. Well, suppose atheism and the self-sampling assumption are true. The self-sampling assumption says you reason as if you're randomly selected from the people in your reference class, so you should think that your reference class isn't too big. So you should think that there aren't too many people that are relevantly like you. Well, for atheism, I think you actually have to have, if you adopt a self-sampling assumption, a very specific type of fine-tuning to make it so that your reference class isn't too big. Right? So like you have to have a world where you have life that's like you, but not too much, because if it's too much, it expands your reference class. So that makes it pretty improbable that you would have just a Goldilocks-sized universe that is that's in a very specific size that makes your existence. It makes it so that it's likely that you exist here under the particular circumstances that you're in. Okay, so that means that conditional on atheism, regardless of whether the self-indication assumption or the self-sampling assumption are true, it's pretty unlikely that you exist. If theism and the self-sampling assumption are true, I don't really know what the odds are that you would exist. It's sort of tricky, but let's grant that just the best assumption for the atheist, which is, let's say, 0% chance that you exist, if theism and the self-sampling assumption were true. Well, okay, but the self-indication assumption plus theism, I think, predict with decently high probability that you would exist. And so this means that when you update on the fact that you exist, the self-indication assumption gets a probabilistic boost, as does theism, because only the conjunction of theism and the self-indication assumption make it reasonably likely that you would exist.
That is interesting. I'm probably going to have to sit down with that one. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I'm probably going to have to sit down and think, like, reason through that one and be like, yeah, where are we getting these? Anyway, I'm going to have to sit down with that one. I'm not going to be able to come up with something off the spot on that. So,
yeah.
And I did.
Yeah, sorry, I sort of blind. I don't think I wrote about that in the article. So
yeah, this is the first time I've ever heard this. So, okay, yeah. I guess another next thing that we might go to for this argument. I mean, doesn't this argument like basically lead us to expect, given theism, that every being which could exist in our universe and which has an overall worthwhile life, is indeed actualized? That seems like that's what theism is predicting on the basis of this argument. But so I say, that's not the case. I mean, like it just seems obvious that there are various agents that could have existed in our universe, firstly, and secondly, would have had a worthwhile life, but yet, thirdly, don't exist. So my parents easily could have had a fifth child, and I mean, like, it's given how my parents are, given the way that they treated us, given their financial means and so on, like, it seems pretty clear to me that that child would indeed have had a life worth living. Similarly, like, I don't know, especially if like theism is true. I mean, here are lots of things that are totally conceivable. Like Mars could have been terraformed, and there could have been like tons of people on there living really well-off lives and so on. Like, or Alpha Centauri or whatever could have had like another, like a life habitable planet, and then a bunch of people just like us on Earth there. So it seems like not every being that could exist in our universe and which has a life worth living is actualized, and yet it seems like theism, on the basis of this argument, should indeed be very strongly predicting that. So we seem to actually indeed have some pretty strong disconfirmation of theism here.
Yeah. Well, I think that it predicts that they all would exist, but I don't think it predicts they would all exist in our universe. What it predicted that they would all exist in the universe, which makes their life best. And so the possible fifth child is like they exist just somewhere else. Now, this is hard to square with Origin's essentialism, but I don't think we should accept that.
Right. So I think
off in greener pastures.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting then that if we do accept Origin essentialism, that this could be a very significant challenge to the argument. And we don't even need to go, we don't even need to go what I was suggesting earlier, which is conjoining it with like hedonism and the kind of skeptical problem. So yeah, that's one thing to say then in response. It's like, well, that's pretty significant. That the argument seems to be requiring the negation of that view, given that it's a relatively popular view, especially for biological organisms. And also, this doesn't just apply to humans, right? So, like, I mean, like, do you think like birds have souls?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, fair enough. I was gonna say if you don't think they have souls, well, then like I could just run this argument in terms of birds, um, but okay.
Yeah. Wait,
Do you, do you think birds go to an afterlife? Is there a birdie heaven?
yeah. Yeah. Justin Crummett has a paper arguing for this. Well, not birds specifically, but
Yeah,
animals in general. And I think it's very convincing. It's like, I mean, why not? They could be made infinitely well off. Maybe they'd be sharing in the beatific vision. Maybe they'd just, like have like tasty food or something.
yeah. Those bird souls with all the nice, beautiful seeds that they get. Okay. Yeah. So
Yeah.
okay. Well, anyway, I just think it's fascinating that it's going to require a view, which at least that this argument is going to require the negation of a view that I at least am very sympathetic towards.
Yeah. I mean, one question is like, um, I'm not sure if you accept origin essentialism. There might be other ways around it. I mean, well, so one is you might think that your existence depends on the circumstances of your birth, but like a qualitative, like one could have existed in a qualitatively identical world. So like where maybe this is just incompatible with origins essentialism, but like I mean, well, I think you're a soul, so I think you could have existed in lots of different circumstances. But I think even if not, it at least seems kind of plausible that like if you had that it always seems kind of plausible that if there was another world that's exactly identical to ours, but just where your parents have a fifth child, that the fifth child in that would have been in this world could be in that one instead. I guess maybe not if you think like, we're just biological organisms, just like maybe that couldn't have the same table as would have existed in this world.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it requires the falsity of origin essentialism. I think I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. So I mean, I incline towards thinking that it does, but also, I mean, like, set aside origin essentialism. I mean, it still seems to require that. Okay, fine. My parents' fifth child isn't actualized in this universe, but is out there somewhere. It's like that just seems crazy. There's like this is where we're getting into like some commitments of the argument, or at least things that are strongly predicted by theism that at least I'm inclined to say are not indeed the case. Like there really is, like the person who had my parents had a fifth child would have been that person, and that person really is out there. Like that soul is out there in some universe, and somehow it's the exact same. Like that very soul would have been the soul that my parents had if they conceived a fifth child. It's like that just seems absurd to me.
Well, I don't find it that absurd, conditional on theism.
Okay.
But one way to go, I think, if you don't accept origin essentialism, if you do accept origin essentialism, is you might think that in any world you could always add more people. There are always more people who could be created and given good lives. And so maybe for that reason, God can sort of satisfice, where it's like he just create enough people where he creates the right cardinality, but he doesn't create every particular person. And maybe if you think that God can kind of satisfice, then that would work. And I think maybe everyone like if you accept origin essentialism and theism, then I think maybe you're just inclined to accept this view, because it just does seem like there could always be more beings that God created if origin essentialism is true, that he didn't. And I don't know, like creating a being and giving them a good life seems pretty good. So I guess, and so I think you would probably, and to get out of the problem of like, well, things, you could always make the world better in some way. You might think God can sort of satisfy us and do just enough because there's an infinite range.
Yeah. So about that, I mean, interesting. So you were suggesting that God can sort of satisfy us, create the right kind of cardinality. So he is indeed creating 2 to the power of 2 to the power of Aleph Null, many people, but how am I going to articulate this? Just give me a second. That seems to lead us to expect that the probability that you exist is at least still like kind of arbitrarily low. It may not be 0 as it, but it still seems arbitrarily low because I mean, let's just take the natural numbers, okay? And suppose that each natural number is like a person, okay? So like there's the person who's the number 1, and there's the person who's the number 2, and the person who's the number 3, and so on. Yes, exactly. My great uncle. No. So yeah, there are these numbers that are like they're the people of the numbers, okay? And all your well, I don't want to say all you're told. Suppose you are indeed told that God creates Aleph Null many of these numbers, but it's just like every quintillionth number. So like 1 gets created, and then quintillion plus 1, and then quintillion times 2 plus 1, and then quintillion times 3 plus 1, and so on. If you're reasoning on the basis, I mean, it just seems like if you're just a randomly chosen number, you should think then that the probability that you exist, given theism, is 1 in quintillion, right? So it's still overwhelmingly low. And then you're not, I mean, even if you get a slight confirmation of theism, it's only going to be slight because the probability that you exist is only ever so slightly higher on theism than it is under atheism. So it's like my worry then, again, I'd have to sit down and kind of flesh this out to make it rigorous and so on. But my worry then is like if we're going the satisficing route and all God needs to do and all that theism predicts is that he creates the right cardinality. I mean, that allows for the probability that I exist to be arbitrarily low, it seems, on theism. Like, I mean, not 0, but still arbitrarily low because
I don't really know. I find it hard to think about exactly what the probability would be. Where it's like if it's the right cardinality, like there are cases where it'll be the right cardinality, but you'll think it'll be unlikely to exist. Where like if you pick every trillionth number and you're a randomly selected number, then it'll be like it'll be the right. They're the same number of numbers divided as there are numbers that are factors of a trillion, but nonetheless you shouldn't be optimistic that you exist. But I don't know, like it doesn't seem in that case. It seems like because there's like the numbers that are being selected is a strict subset of the total numbers, but and there's a clear amount of exactly how much of it there is of the total numbers. Like it's like at 1 in every trillion. But here it's sort of like it's not clear how many possible agents there are that are not being created. So here I think it would just be really unclear what the probability is.
I mean, I think it's inscrutable, but that kind of destroys the argument, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I'm suspicious that the probability of things can be inscrutable. But I don't know, like, suppose there are 2 possibilities. One theory says the probability of an event is inscrutable, and the other says it's 0. You should go with and then the event occurs. You should go with the theory that says that it's inscrutable. And I think this problem will be inherited by most atheistic views that entail that there are best 2 people. And so as a result, like, suppose there's a theory which is that there's no evil in the world. And skeptical theism says that the odds that there's evil in the world is inscrutable. Upon finding out that there's evil in the world, you get confirmation for skeptical theism over the theory that there's no evil in the world, because an event with inscrutable probability, is more likely than an event with no probability. Of course, exactly how to work out the math, or like how to be precise about this, and like, okay, what if it was inscrutable versus 1 in a quadrillion or something, and then maybe you have like weird Dutch book arguments. This will get really tricky, but I don't think it's super clear what to say about this.
Right. Well, I mean, if the probability of E given H is inscrutable, then the probability of H given E is going to be inscrutable. So you're not going to be able to have evidence for at least this thing can't confirm the hypothesis. That just follows from Bayes' theorem. If like the right hand side is inscrutable, then the left hand side is going to be inscrutable as well.
Yeah.
So I actually don't think it would confirm skeptical theism in that sort of case. But so that's why I'm worried. Like, because when you have an inscrutable probability in there, you actually don't get confirmation of skeptical theism when one theory says it's 0 and the other one says it's inscrutable. Because when you run through the Bayesian calculation, the right hand side actually turns out being inscrutable. Because in the right hand side, one of the probabilities is inscrutable that you multiply, right? Probability of E given H, right? The evidence given the hypothesis. And so then it's going to just follow that the left hand side, probably H given E, is going to be inscrutable as well. So then you're not going to be able to confirm theism on the basis of the argument, basically.
Yeah. So I don't know I mean, for reasons like this, I'm suspicious that probabilities can be inscrutable in the first place.
I think that's fair, but I mean, it's hard to say. It's hard to, like, what are we supposed to say if it's not inscrutable? Like, are we just like throwing up our hands and like it's somewhere between 0 and 1 or something? Like,
I mean, I think, there's just some rational kind of brute prior where it's just like 0.15 where there isn't like a further explanation.
Okay, hold on. But then when you get some rational brute prior, I wonder, like, can't the atheist just do that to like the rational brute prior that I exist or something like that? And then they don't really have much of a problem with the argument.
Yeah, but I think the prior of that is 0 because it's 0.
You'd say it's actually not rational because we have a good argument against it, namely the self-indication assumption argument.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair response to that.
Yeah. This argument, it raises a whole host of really.
Yeah. That's why I love it. It's so interesting.
Yeah, it invokes the two most confusing things in philosophy, which is the infinite and anthropics. And
modality as well.
Yeah.
And probability. So it's like you got all the stuff in there. It's a modality, probability. Okay, yeah. Okay, so that was another thing that I at least wanted to cover. That, like, why isn't every being that could exist in our universe, which has a worthwhile life, actualized? So that's what we were just going over. I guess the final thing that I wanted to cover was, like, I never know the rules of this game of divine psychology or psychoanalysis. Like, I feel like everyone predicts whatever the hell they want, like, basically on the basis of theism. Like, oh yeah, that would be good. So, like, yeah, God would do that. And then someone else is like, oh yeah, no, the negation of that would be good. So, like, God's gonna do that. And other people are like, no, but that good is connected up to some other bad things. So God definitely wouldn't do that. Or like other people are like, oh no, the production of that good involves violating certain deontological constraints. So God wouldn't do that. It's like, I don't. Sometimes I really struggle to see how theism predicts these sorts of things. So, like, in this case, it seems like you're saying something along the lines of, well, it'd be good for these agents to exist, and plausibly God would want to actualize good things, and so very plausibly God would actualize all these agents. But, like, I don't know what God's in the business of wanting. At the very least, for this argument, like, I don't know if he just wants to maximize goodness. Is God in the maximizing business? I don't know. Does he just want to create an overall good world? I don't know. Does he want to? Like, I don't know. It seems like this argument has a particular conception of the divine psychology that God's in the business of maximizing, and I don't see why God would be in the maximizing business, basically.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I'll give reasons in a moment, but even if you're not super sure what God would do, I think, if there's some probability that he would maximize, then conditional on SIA, it's like, oh, well, I exist, so guess he decided to maximize. But I don't know. I mean, I think if you think God is maximally good, which is sort of like the definition, then I think you'll want to say that it doesn't seem like there can't be a maximally good being if there's another being whose existence would be even better. If there's another being who's, relevantly like God, but would just do more good stuff.
But does that mean that the being is better? That's not clear.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe, this is just my utilitarianism creeping in, but I think it is sort of plausible. And I mean, here's one plausible principle. It's like, if you have the option to do the maximal amount of good or some less than the maximal amount of good, and you can do either of them without needing to jeopardize anything of value, then you should do the thing that does the greatest amount of good, right? So, if I can either wave my hands and save 1 billion people, or wave my hands and save 500 people, I think it seems like a perfect being would wave their hands and save the 1 billion people. Where just if you can do more good rather than less, and you don't have to sacrifice anything, it seems like you would do the more good.
Right. This is one of those principles where it's like, yeah, it seems plausible in principle, but then like it gets counterexampled later on. Like that's the sort of thing. No, I don't have a counterexample in mind. But
okay, yeah.
But my point is just like this is one of those cases where it's like it sounds plausible, but then you get into like the literature on like, I don't know, super irrigation and like other sorts of things, and then also these should claims are a little bit loose. Like, is this like an obligation, or are we just saying it would be a good thing for them to do it, or like we get into the weeds very, very quickly. Anyway, I just voicing concerns.
So maybe it would be like when you get into the weeds here, like of the literature around super irrigation and stuff, you do get kind of tricky stuff about, okay, like under what conditions are you required to do good things? But it seems at least supererogatory. But surely God would do things that are supererogatory and good because they're good, and he's maximally good.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know what God would do.
A being who does the supererogatory thing seems greater than one who doesn't, because they have a better moral character. They do the right thing even when they're not required to, when it's just sort of like good for them to do it.
Does that mean they have a better moral character? Or does that just mean like, I mean, surely they could have an equally good moral character, but that moral character is consistent with doing the supererogatory thing, is also consistent with doing the very good but not supererogatory thing?
I think they would have a better moral character if all else is equal. And I'll give you an example. Like, suppose that, so pretending for a moment that supererogation is real. Here's a classic case that's not supererogatory. Running into a burning building at significant personal cost to save a child. That would be a clear example of a supererogatory action. But if there are two people and two twins, you know no difference between them, but then one of them does that and the other one doesn't, I think you should think, yeah, the twin who was willing to make significant personal sacrifice for the sake of doing what was right but not required, that person's a better person. It seems like doing supererogatory things at least sort of indicates that you're a better person because you're more willing to do right things. And I don't know, and there does seem to be something kind of strange about a God just kind of like arbitrarily choosing to like, okay, I could create Beth 2 people, and I could make every possible being in existence and really well off, but like, I'll just stop at like 105 billion for no reason. That seems sort of strange and arbitrary.
I mean, it doesn't need to be for no reason. I mean, see, that's the thing. Like, another thing that you mentioned was, like, provided that there aren't sacrifices that are to be made. And one thing I'm thinking is, like, I mean, how do we know that there aren't sacrifices that God is making? I mean, like, lots of different values might come into play in the creation of worlds. Maybe there are certain aesthetic values. Like, one reason that Alexander Proust mentions in his paper, like, Divine Creative Freedom, is that, he argues for this incommensurability thesis that, there are, like, classes of worlds which are kind of incommensurable with one another with respect to their value. Some of them might be worlds in which just God alone exists, because, I mean, indeed, Proust thinks that has a lot of, like, value. It's like there's a supreme kind of simplicity and elegance and beauty to that kind of world, purity to that world as well. There's not, like, an admixture of evil and so on. So, like, there are certain unique values that world instantiates. And then there are certain unique values that other worlds can instantiate. And I'm not sure if this, like, creating Beth 2, like, would that sacrifice maybe like a world with Beth 2 agents is just so less elegant and less beautiful, and like the aesthetic values of that are just like very disvaluable or something like that. I don't know. Like, maybe it's morally pretty valuable, but I don't know, aesthetically and so on. And I mean, I don't know how God weighs those sorts of things. And yeah.
I'm inclined to think that aesthetic values are not actual values. That they don't have value independently. And even if they do have value independently, like it doesn't seem like they have enough, you know. Like imagine there's this really pristine world, and you could create in the world just huge numbers of people who would live these really happy lives, and they'd be, you know, super glad that they exist. But it would be sort of like not super aesthetically pleasing. Maybe the creatures are kind of ugly. It seems wrong to not do that. And the last
Right. Well,
point,
yeah. I
sorry,
mean,
yeah,
well, I agree that there may very well be certain cases that are clear cases in which the relevant moral reasons very much evidently outweigh the relevant aesthetic reasons. But my point is, like, I'm not talking about the clear cases. Like, I'm talking about one of these cases where it's like, at least to me, it's not clear that the moral reasons must seriously and evidently outweigh like the non-moral reasons against actualizing the two agents. In fact, if well, anyway, I was just gonna say, like, again, I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure what to say about how God weighs these sorts of things, and without building in lots of these auxiliary assumptions that make the prior probability of theism just seem very, very low.
yeah. I mean, I think so. One difference between you and I maybe is like I think these auxiliary assumptions are things that I just think are independently true.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think, you know, I don't think it's a cost if you already think everyone should think that. Uh, but I mean, if even if you think maybe, you know, there's a kind of low probability, maybe there's a whole range of things that God might do, or maybe he'd create a Beth 2 people, maybe he'd create Beth 1 people just for the hell of it. Maybe he'd create nothing. Like, okay, there, it seems at least not terribly improbable that he'd create Beth 2 people. But on atheism, the odds are, I think, much, much lower because you can at least tell a very plausible story about why he would, and I don't think you can on atheism.
Yeah. I mean, I know Neil Manson criticizes this sort of reasoning with his how not to be generous to fine tuning skeptics in his that's the paper title. I think it's religious studies, where he's like, often like theists. Anyway, I think it's a little bit that sort of reasoning is a little bit quick, but go on. I interrupted you.
Yeah. Well, I have there's another point that I'll raise. It's sort of like it's another response to this broad worry. But if you have something more to say on this one,
No, that's fine.
yeah,
I'd like to hear that because yeah, go on.
yeah. So, oh wait, but now I might have forgotten what it was. Oh yeah, it's that I feel like aesthetically. I mean, just in terms of my intuitions here, it seems like just the most kind of like aesthetic world is like there's something sort of aesthetic about universalism where it's like everyone, even the people who, you know, spend their life being evil and cursing God and stuff, they all end up eventually being perfectly good and, you know, loving the good and being in communion with God. There's something really, you know, elegant and nice about that picture of reality. But if you expand that picture of reality to every possible agent that could exist, um, like that seems like an even more compelling picture of reality. Where it's like just
Maybe.
every possible agent that could exist just exists and lives this very good life, as good as their life could possibly be.
Yeah, I mean, now we're starting to get into so like you mentioned this prospect earlier, and this was probably the final thing that I wanted to mention. But it's like if God is indeed in this maximizing business, as the argument seems to require, then it's like, I mean, like look around. I mean, like it seems like a lot of people that they like the utility of their lives is certainly not maximized, their welfare is not maximized, and what you were just saying right there, you know, you're like living the best lives that they could live. It's like, well, no, that's not the case for many people. And even if they're going to have like an infinite afterlife in which they, you know, experience bliss and so on, like could have been better if their lives here were better. And maybe you're sympathetic to this because I mean, you know, I think you like the problem of evil, and you know, you probably think, yeah, God would plausibly be in the maximizing business, but evidently, look around. So I'm wondering if this argument can sort of just be wielded against itself if you look around and see that if God were in the maximizing business, as this argument seems to require, well, then we would very strongly predict things that are evidently not the case.
Yeah, yeah. I think, you know, I agree with that basic worry. I think it is very hard to see how our world is like maximally good. But I think this, just whether you find this plausible will hinge on whether you find the problem of evil plausible, which I really do. I think it's a very convincing argument. But if you think that there's some theodicy that explains why there are the world's evils, like soul building or free will, or skeptical theism, they say you're not supposed to call it a theodicy; it's a defense. But it's close enough to a theodicy where it's just like maybe there are bads in this world that are necessary to serve some greater purpose, or just a whole host of other theodicies. Then I think that sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, I mean, I could probably interject if you want. I mean,
Yeah.
The thing that I worry about is that, like, if you start to go then those theodical routes, then that's just gonna be able to be turned back on this argument itself, like the original argument. Like, oh yeah, maybe there are like certain outweighing goods. Well, like, sure, yeah, but maybe there's certain outweighing bads for God creating like the Beth 2 agents or something like that. So if that suffices as a response to the problem of evil, it seems like the potential for outweighing bads is going to suffice as a response to this argument for theism. And we could go on down the list, like, maybe there are unknown. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think that's possible, but I mean, I think what the theists would want to say here is they would say, look, these at least tell a sort of plausible story about why evil is not, there might be evil if theism were true. There might be a world roughly like ours where it has the full range of evil. And they say, we have all these really good reasons to endorse theism. And so on account of our many good reasons to endorse theism, we should think that the current world, like they're one of the explanations for evil is true, where if there could be outweighing reasons, but we should think probably there aren't outweighing reasons in the other direction because we have reason to think that theism is true, and consequently to think that
right, this very argument that's being called into question. But I mean, if they go that route, then I wonder if like they're making this argument kind of parasitic on the success of these other arguments, which the atheist probably isn't going to grant are successful.
Well, I think, I mean, for the argument to work, it'll, for the argument to establish theism with decently high probability, I think it'll rely on a solution to the problem of evil. But, like, if theism is true, we already need a solution to the problem of evil. And so, like, I think this will still give a major boost against theism, because the theistic hypothesis is going to be, it's going to already require saying there's some reason why these evils serve outweighing goods or something like that. And so if that's already part of the hypothesis, then adding in the assumption that God would create Beth 2 people, that's not a cost to that. And it allows you to explain that I exist.
Yeah, this is another one of those cases where I'd probably have to sit down and like see what auxiliaries are being added where, and how, and like how it affects the probability calculus. So this is one of those cases where I'd have to sit down and think about it further.
Yeah, I mean, here I think it would not affect the probability calculus, and the reason is just that theism, it already is going to have to say that there's a solution to the problem of evil for theism to be correct. And so if that's true, then that for this argument to work, there has to be a solution to the problem of evil. It's not going to be an additional cost because it's a tax that the theist has already paid. Yeah. No, I mean that may very well be right.
But the question is, how plausible is that auxiliary assumption? And then I mean, like, again, like the atheist is not going to. I mean, they're going to think that that's a very, very implausible auxiliary. I think, at least if the atheist is convinced by the problem of evil. I'll just say that.
Yeah, but if the atheist is convinced by the problem of evil, then they're like, they're already not going to be a theist on account of the problem of evil. So it may be a very significant cost, but the point is, it's not an additional cost born as a result of this argument, because for theism to be true, you're already going to have to explain evil.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, I agree with. Well, I think I've come to agree with that particular point. I was just highlighting that that doesn't make it all hunky dory for the theist in the end. That was sort of my
right. Yeah. The theist is going to need to have something to say about evil.
Yeah.
One, just going back a bit to things we were talking about origin essentialism. So I think the theist who accepts origin essentialism is going to have kind of a pretty big puzzle on their hands, which is that they're going to get results that are way too pro-natalist, where like if you think that, I mean, if you think universalism is true, which I think is very hard to deny, conditional theism, or even if you don't think universalism is true, but you think that that what many people will live a good afterlife, such that existing is on net a good thing, is on average an infinitely good thing, then you're just going to get a result that like creating a person is something that's infinitely fortunate. And so like even if suppose you have a child and then you torture the child for 4 years and then kill them, I think most people would want to say that you shouldn't do that. That it would be worse to do that than to just not have the child at all. But on this account, if you accept theism plus sort of plausible assumptions, where then you get if you accept origin essentialism, then it's like, no, they wouldn't have otherwise existed, and so and they'll be infinitely repaid in the afterlife, unless you think they're going to go to hell, which is even more implausible. I'd imagine just the Calvinists being like, no, we have a great solution to the problem. The babies are going to go to hell. And so, yeah, I think that if you accept theism and origin essentialism, then you get results that are just way too pro-natalist. While saying, no, the children already exist, but just elsewhere, you get more, less ridiculously pro-natalist results.
Yeah, I mean, well, so I wasn't listening as carefully as I should have at the outset of the description, because I mean, it seems like this child could indeed exist if they. I mean, they could indeed exist and not get tortured, because the parents could conceive of that child at the same time and under the same conditions, and yet not go on to torture them, right? I mean, like that's like a later decision that's independent.
Yeah,
go on.
Obviously, torturing them would be wrong, but suppose there's just a button that I have the choice of pressing, and this button, it would create a child somewhere far away, and then they would slowly starve to death or something. I think it would be wrong to press the button. I think most people would agree with that. But if you're a theist, then I think you should think that it's good to press the button, because, or if you're a theist and an origin essentialist, then you should think that it's good to press the button, because otherwise the person created by the button being pressed wouldn't have otherwise existed, and they'll be infinitely well off, or in expectation.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably correct, but I mean, it could still be impermissible to press the button. I mean, you could be violating certain deontological constraints and pressing the button. So like, it could still be impermissible. I mean, it could be like good on the whole. Like, I mean, of course, it's surely even the. Well, no, you do need the origin essentialism, but like, yeah, given the origin essentialism, yeah, it seems to be good on the whole, in the sense of, yeah, the net balance of utility has increased, and this person lives a worthwhile life. In fact, their net utility is like positive infinity or whatever. It would be good. That's not implausible. That's just a consequence. Like, I don't know. That doesn't seem implausible. I mean, it's impermissible. That's plausible to me. But things can be good and impermissible. Like, they can have good outcomes. I mean, like, that's just the whole deontological theory. Like, there can be, something could be good on the whole, but still nevertheless be impermissible because it violates certain deontological constraints.
Yeah. Well, so even if we grant this sort of fiction that things can be good but impermissible, I think, one is that it just doesn't even seem like a good state of affairs, right? Like, let's imagine you just discovered that there was this device that just created babies and then hurled them into the ocean to die. You wouldn't think, oh, that's great news. It's so fortunate that that's happening. But on this account, you should, because it's like it's making all these great things happen. And then second, I think it's a little bit hard to see why it would be impermissible, where there are lots of cases where an action is good and impermissible, but it seems like if your action it harms someone, but they end up being benefited infinitely more in the long run, then it seems like that wouldn't be impermissible. You're permitted to, like, if a person's about to commit suicide, it seems like you're permitted to cause them slight pain to prevent their suicide, especially if they would go on to live an infinitely good afterlife. like, I think you should say there's a strong pro tanto reason not to override someone's will and override their autonomy, but surely it can be outweighed by just making a person infinitely better off.
I'm not so sure. I mean, like, I think deontologists are going to be like, I mean, if it involves like literally like torturing the person, no, or like if it involves like such a severe violation of their rights, like some of their most deep and basic and important human rights, then I think they're going to say no. It doesn't make it worth it. Anyway, I mean, now we're just getting to the kind of debate between the consequentialists and non-consequentialists. So, and that is. I
That's outside the scope of this current essay.
Yeah, that is outside the scope of this article. Which, yeah, oh my gosh, I've had to say that
more
so
on
many
this
times.
C, and then you have 40.
Yes, for more on this C, X, Y, Z. Be sure to cite yourself like 4 times, of course.
Yeah, you know, the greatest scholars in the field that have published on this, which just happens to be, you know, me 4 times.
Me 4 times, and all my like buddies who agree with me, basically.
Yeah, it is sort of funny where it's like in papers it'll have like, you know, for more on the C, and then they'll list like 20 names. It's like I wasn't that curious to find like 20 other random papers.
Right. I mean, no, I think that's why things like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Philosophy Compass are so nice, because you can be like, for more on this, see, and you cite the one article and the references therein. So it's like, just see that. That's what's best. That's what I love.
Yeah. All right. I think we sort of covered the main things. Do you have any?
Right. I think we've proved theism. I think everyone should just start getting on their knees and praying.
Yeah, we've actually proved Christianity more specifically.
Not just
and like Eastern Orthodoxy more specifically.
Oh yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. Oh, now we're gonna start being toxic now, aren't we?
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Joe. Like, I think you had really interesting and useful things to say, and I think you raised a lot of objections that I had not yet thought of, but I think, you know, they're very interesting, and I'm quite glad you came on and presented.
Well, thank you for having me on. I think it's a fascinating argument, and I think, you know, you push back really nicely against my objections, and I thought it was I think it's a super fascinating argument, and I really hope you guys can publish this paper because it's great.
All right. Thanks so much. Have a good one. Bye.